contribution should be corrected in starting from and ending with Mary Wollstonecraft and Jane Austen. It will, in fact, relate Mary Wollstonecraft's vindication of the rights of women with Jane Austen's characterization of her, particularly Pride and Prejudice ones. Even if it is unsure if Austen read Wollstonecraft's works, but the author seems to share the stand against a biological justification of sexist prejudices. They claim and depict women firstly as rational beings. Gender binarism is challenged through political invective in Wollstonecraft and irony in Austen. Mary Wollstonecraft reports her contemporary women's education as weakening. Social imperative to beauty transforms women's bodies in prisons. Women are slaves of their bodies because they are taught from their infancy to comply to men's expectations. Pride and Prejudice as well might be considered a novel built on the shift, the back and forth of attention among women and men and among its main female characters. Both Wollstonecraft and Austen texts point out how distractibility is reconceived by Enlightenment thinkers as a problem of the rational consciousness, a natural but challenging tendency of the mind. Natalie Phillips, director of the Literary Neuroscience and the Digital Humanities Laboratory at Michigan University in her Distraction, Problems of Attention in 18th Century Literature, argues that a shift occurs in Enlightenment understanding of distraction. 18th century literature contributes to rethink the scatterbrained minds at the border with madness. They lead from a monofocal to a multifocal concept of this mental faculty. The monofocal model can be traced back to meditative religious tradition. It conceives distraction as a sinful diversion from attention's natural objects and relies on the beam metaphor for its characterization. The multifocal model instead takes the stimuli as naturally multiple as the mental coordinations activities necessary to hold the attention. Mental tendency to disperse is normalized and not anymore conceived only as a moral force. Moreover, rhythmic metaphors are increasingly used to describe mental flows. Phillips' thesis is that this long-lasting 18th century rethinking of distraction offers a theoretic and epistemological foundation to the most recent neuroscientific studies. According to her analysis, 18th century literature begins to theorize neural plasticity. It depicts the continuum attention distractions with attention peaks and interstitial distractions, a model that funds and somehow still satisfies current neuroscientific paradigms that considers flows of attentions interrupted by those of concentration. Her analysis contributes to the neuroturn within the humanities, proposing an fMRI-based research on pleasure and close reading Jane Austen's novels. According to this experimental study on reading Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice, as well as Mansfield Park, give shape to those states of mind that most recent neuroscientific literature name divided attention, multitasking, multisensorial perceptions. In Austen's novels, the multifocal model is not only represented, but also used as a fictional tool because able to transmit flexibility and cognitive richness. Pride and Prejudice takes up the idea, I quote, that distraction contains a kernel of creative energy and turns it into a literary device. A grammar of distraction is used to explore heroine's lapsus, but also to interact with readers' curiosity. She writes that attention is the coin of Austen's narrative economy. Her novels literally divide the capacity for attention among characters, allocating narrative space to figures according to the relative sophistication of their concentration. Mental complexity emerges through a system that grants her heroines the ability to multitask and deprives minor characters of the same. Austen links intricate minds with distraction and simple minds with narrow of Austen female protagonists highlights the normative dimension of distraction. Who delimitates what is distraction and what it is not? Who decides what deserves attention? Being distracted means to disregard. It recalls the servile experience of obedience to attend to superior orders. Elizabeth Bennet, Liveliness of Mind, is then granted by her capacity for distraction as a generative ability. While other characters are limited in their interests, she is able nevertheless, or precisely because of her absent-mindedness, to account for multiple points of view and layers of reality. Elizabeth is proudly impertinent, a lively mind, sick of civility, of deference, of officious attentions. I quote, "She's disgusted with the women who were always speaking and looking and thinking for male approbation alone," end of quote. Elizabeth's characterization as lively, playful, and quick emerges then through the comparison with other characters focused blindness. For example, Lydia and Miss Bingley, cognitive vacancy, Catherine de Bourgh, excessive vigilance, her sister Mary's hyperfocus, especially when reading or repeating what she read. The opposite pole of her style of mental presence is represented by her mother, Mrs. Bennet, who shows all frivolousness and worldliness characteristics of Wollstonecraft's ladies. Mrs. Bennet suffers from nerves. She is a woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. When she was discontented, I quote, "She fancied herself nervous. Her solace was visiting and news, while Elizabeth wants is meditation and alone walks." Elizabeth is a characters analyst. She is subject to distractive absorptions too, but these are truly different from her sister's romantic reverie. She faces two main moments of complete absorptions, astonishing mind-wandering. One that is reported in this quote occurs after having visited Pemberley House. While walking with Aunt and Uncle Gardiner in the woods, her thoughts are fixated elsewhere, still in the house. Elizabeth is completely distracted by her thoughts also at the Netherfield ball, where she replies to Mr. Darcy, explicitly trying to sketch his personality. Without knowing what she said, I quote, "For her thoughts had wandered far from the subject," end of the quote. Women vigilance states, somehow escaped by distractions, are pivotal for narrative expediency in Austen and political invectives in Wollstonecraft, who explicitly report female upbringing as a servile one. Girls cultivate habits of inferiority. Their thoughts are confined to meaningless things such as dolls, dresses, gossip. In a vindication, Wollstonecraft's attack feminine novels reading too. These stories, he writes, take women caught up in stupid daydreams, sentimentality, corrupting prejudice that glorify defects as virtues. She suggests that education could make women fond of more meaningful readings of politics or history. However, she regards any kind of reading, and I quote, as better than leaving a blank still a blank, because the mind must be a little enlarged and a little straightened by the slight exertion of its thinking power that novel reading may bring. Nonetheless, she uses novels, namely Maria fiction and The Wrong of Women of Maria, as an expressive and educational tool. Narrated experiences are so close to her autobiographical experience that Virginia Woolf comments them, explicitly comparing her novels to Austen's one. She writes that if Jane Austen had crouched as a child on her house landing to stop her father from beating her mother, her soul might have been ignited with such a passion against tyranny that perhaps all her novels would have been consumed in one cry for justice. Wollstonecraft characters aim to challenge the traditional romantic expectation horizons. Her heroines are models of women alternative also to those represented by Austen, the men's fantasies, but take possession of their own life, exercising independence. Mary, for example, is self-educated as Elizabeth Bennet, and she has a rational development as the author herself, who was so committed to the girls' educational rights that founded a women's school and dedicated her very first essay to the education of daughters. In Pride and Prejudice as well, as in the Vindications, women's sexed bodies need to be military guarded in order to preserve their chastity, but at the same time to guarantee their servile desirability ahead of marriages. Matrimonial arrangements solely can provide them, in fact, with an improvement of their socioeconomical conditions. Mrs. Bennet's obsession for her daughter's marriages is then anything but inappropriate, since Longbourn's inheritance obligations exclude women. Elizabeth instead conceives marriage as the ideal friendship of intelligence for which Wollstonecraft advocates. Hence, she rejects the matrimonial market logics that wanted her married with a hereditable cousin, Mr. Collins. Elizabeth first urged and then lamented not no to Mr. Collins' proposal might be interpreted as an example of sociolinguistic discursive injustice. Her words seem less effective. She can do less with her words because of a gender role in the matrimonial market. Wollstonecraft's vindication indeed analyzes and partially deconstructs gender binaries directly in its alleged naturality. If inferiority regarding physical force cannot in fact be denied as a natural law, men aim to reinforce their bodily primacy, she writes, so as to make us mere alluring objects for a moment. If Austen's female characters have been associated with a proto-feminist vocation, Wollstonecraft's words have been considered as contributing to invent a whole feminist tradition. I quote, she read that taught from their infancy that beauty is human sceptre, the mind shapes itself to the body, and roaming around in its gilt cage, it only seeks to adorn its prisons. Men have various employments and pursuits that engage their attention and give a character to the opening mind, but women confined to one pursuit and having their thoughts constantly directed to the most insignificant part of themselves, seldom extend their view beyond the triumph of the hour. But if their understanding were emancipated from the slavery to which the pride and sensuality of men and their short-sighted desire has subjected them, we would probably read of their weakness with surprise. End of the quote. Wollstonecraft combines the vigilance, the obsessive attentions to posture and gesture which women are obliged to, not only with slavery, but with military discipline too. These trainings to please and obey are similar also because soldiers and women both confront the world before having had the chance to strengthen their bodies and mind according to moral and rational principles. Austen brings often together the poles of this comparison so that she almost seems to have read and appreciated Wollstonecraft's reflections on women military alert. Lady Catherine de Bourgh, for example, is named a commission of the peace of the country. The younger and shallower Bennet's sister instead live for the visit to the modist, for new dresses, but above all for the balls, especially those with the officers. When a regiment settles its headquarters in Meryton, Bennet's sisters love to go there unsupervised, and once there, their attention was no longer to be gained. I quote, their eyes were immediately wandering up in the street in quest of the officers, and nothing less than a very smart bonnet indeed, or a really new muslin in a shop window could recall them. The topos is revisited also in Lydia's imagining with the creative eye of at least 6 flirting officers. Critic viewpoint on the couple women soldiers is expressed as always by Elizabeth's sharp sarcasm. Wollstonecraft compares the seriousness of Western women's subjugation to Eastern ones. Chinese or Egyptian harem and systems are told as oppressive as English subordination of women. Likewise, in Austen's novels, particularly in Mansfield Park, the context of England as a colonial empire, its values regime, is limited to represent a differentiating background, a topic about which the author herself seems distraught. This approach earned them allegations of Orientalism. Wollstonecraft uses, in fact, Eastern metaphors to speak on solely European issues. She is unable to link abolitionist struggles against colonial slavery and vindication of women's emancipatory rights. She uses other servile experiences only as a rhetoric arguments to reinforce her claims. Said indeed read Austen's Mansfield Park as an example, one of the most explicit among her novels of writers' agreement to colonial expansion. Bertram's estate in Antigua, presumably a sugar plantation maintained by slave labor, is synchronized with the domestic dimension of Mansfield Park. Austen belonged to a slave-owning society, and Said admits that it would be silly to expect her to treat slavery with anything like the passion of an abolitionist. However, his contrapuntal reading is partially blind to Austen ambiguity's complexity in novelistic polyphony. The silence that surrounds in the novel Antigua Colonies, the one that follows every attempt within the novel to discuss pre-imperialistic English historical context that is characterized, for example, by French rivalry, do not imply a plain agreement of Austen to imperial values, and these elements might all be read also as fractures, interruptions, leaks into the anything but flat overall addition of Austen to imperialism as well as sexism. Colonialism is naturally accepted as both a resource to exploit and a treat to exercise. At the same time, it is a source of discomfort. It disrupts groups' conversation and underpins the novel storylines. Austen is among the most readable and less simple writers ever existed. Her novels are enriched by latent senses, complications, contradictions among the many points of view for which the novels make space. And Wollstonecraft is nonetheless quite aware of class differences. Richer women presented for her more pronounced traits of idleness, laziness, negligence of their rational duties besides their moral ones. Who is poor, lacking any education, was in no position to think or act independently. Her concern is then for middle-class women because they appear to be in the most natural states. Their status makes their moral independence more likely to be found. She does not use the more recent and explicitly feminist concept of gender, but rather that of sex, however, attributing its similar functions as a theoretical lockpick. She speaks, for example, on behalf of her sex, namely starting from her experience as a woman and claiming for a female universality, focusing on what produces and reproduces the social relations of difference and inequality among the two sexes. Charm, childishness, delicacy of sentiment, taste, these are for Wollstonecraft all synonyms of weakness of mind and body. She reports Gates' education devoted to these values as sacrificial. They are not allowed to run wild as their male peers. Women are infantilized and reduced to animals because their bodily and mental energy is culturally and not naturally beauty and manners. Education is a central battlefield for past and current feminists, from those vindicating sexual differences and those more focused on highlighting the gendered dimension of culture, politics, and society. Wollstonecraft's provocation, however, that invites women to virilize themselves shows a contradiction implicit somehow in every future vindication of equality among men and women, namely an homologation mechanism that tends to propose male-based models as universally valid. In conclusion, and according to the elements collected so far in our reading of mental presence fluctuations in Wollstonecraft and Austen, we could turn back to Phillips' experiment on distraction tracking, and we might consider it as illegitimately claiming to universality too. Moreover, it suffers of the defects, I think, common in many laboratory-based experiments on this faculty. In the first place, there is a lack of environmental awareness that fails to account for an eminently context-related capacity. Reading in a laboratory, no matter if pleasurably or closely, is somehow an incomparable experience to that ordinarily done by readers, for example, reading while commuting. In the second place, the experiment involves only highly educated, probably Western students, and this is a population sample that not only cannot pretend any universal or general valency, but it also does not account for impacting cultural differences toward these as well as every mental attitude. Thirdly, Phillips' analysis misses to problematize categories used in the laboratory experiment, such as the one of close reading in their relationship with the distractibility topic itself. As suggested by literary critic Michael Wood, close reading or close listening or close viewing might be precisely an exercise in distraction, or at least a practice closely related to that habit, as long as one overdoes it. Reading, listening, or viewing closely implies, in fact, a self-policing that prevents getting too close to the novel, song, or film, or dispersing into their secondary details. I hope that these can be some hints for the discussion, and in my last slide, I've reported all the bibliographic references that I've been using, and thank you for your attention.